All right, good evening, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here this evening as we're joined by Elizabeth T. Kraft, and she'll be speaking about her new book, Yankee Doodle Dandy, George M. Cohan, and the Broadway Stage. Now, before I formally introduce Elizabeth, I'm going to just let you know a little bit about Village Preservation if you are unfamiliar with us. We were founded in 1980 and we work to document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've helped secure landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings, and we host about 75 plus free programs like this throughout the year. Now, we are a members-based organization, so continued support from the public is an absolute necessity for us. Now, if you're just interested in learning a little bit more about what we do, some of the other events that we host, or if you would consider giving us a donation or even becoming a member, go ahead and scan that QR code that you see on your screen, or you can go and head over to villagepreservation.org, learn a little bit more about the advocacy work that we do, the education work that we do, and some of the other programs that are on offer. And to just give you a quick sample of some of those programs, tomorrow evening, we are having a program on Spaces of Enslavement, a history of slavery and resistance in Dutch New York, tomorrow at 6 p.m., and that is a virtual program. And then next week, Wednesday, November 20th, in partnership with Anthology Film Archive, this is an in-person event. It is a special film screening and panel discussion dedicated to Milos Forman, a tribute. And it's a screening of his film debut and a conversation with his writers. Now to introduce this evening's guest. Elizabeth T. Kraft is an associate professor in the School of Music at the University of Utah. Her interdisciplinary research examines how music expresses sociopolitical values and shapes national identity, with a particular focus on musical theater from the early 20th century to the present. Through her work, she explores the intricate relationships between music, culture, and societal issues. Elizabeth, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, William, and thank you all for coming. I also want to thank those who have been part of the community that supported the creation of this book, including a couple of folks who shared images that I use in my presentation today, David Collins and Scott A. Sandage. I'm going to share my screen so I can share some great images and audio clips with you. It was such a joy to work on this book. From beginning to end, I stayed fascinated with George M. Cohan. He's an intriguingly multifaceted figure. He was a composer, a lyricist, a playwright, a star actor and dancer, a director, a producer, a theater owner. My book delves into a lot of these different roles and the many ways he had an impact on American society and Broadway in the early 20th century. So there are many angles I could take today. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about Cohan and then focus on a couple of themes from the book. First, how he, as a lower class vaudevillian from a then marginalized background, up from the immigrant group of Irish Americans, how he established a Yankee Doodle Dandy patriotic persona and staged patriotism in his shows and gave the nation some of its most memorable patriotic songs. And second, how he helped make Broadway, a street in New York, Broadway. And this is a story of New York, but also of the nation. Like perhaps many of you here, I grew up singing "You're a Grand Old Flag." You're a grand old flag, you're a high-flying flag. And the Yankee Doodle Boy. I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, Yankee Doodle do or die. These have become like folk songs in American culture. Some people can link the songs to the man who wrote them, Perhaps they've seen the film Yankee Doodle Dandy starring Jimmy Cagney about Cohan's life. Or perhaps they've seen the Cohan statue in Duffy Square in Manhattan, the only statue of a Broadway artist in that broader hub known as Times Square. And for musical theater buffs, Cohan is a legend, proclaimed the father of musical comedy. Generally, though, when I was writing this book and telling people, friends and acquaintances who I was writing about, I would get an uncertain look until I named a few songs, and if that didn't ring a bell, sang a few bars. Biographer John McCabe wrote in 1973 that Cohan was something of an unforgettable, forgotten man. And if anything, he's even more forgotten since then. I started learning about Cohan while researching for another project on how members of immigrant groups have told their stories through musical theater. I found myself wanting to know more, and that took me to the collection of his papers at the Museum of the City of New York, where I could read scripts with handwritten markings still on them and see the orchestral parts that pit musicians actually used. Into the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center Plaza, where I could see newspaper clippings and even see a tiny bit of footage of Cohan performing. To the Schubert Archive in the Lyceum Theater on West 45th Street, where I could see Cohan and his partner's early business papers, and to the Hampton Booth Theater Library at the Players Social Club, where I could see beautifully bound volumes of his script, signed by the playwright. I soon found myself launched into this project, the first book on Cohan in 50 years, and the first to focus on his cultural impact on Broadway and in the United States. In his day, Cohan was a celebrity at a time when the very nature of celebrity was being reshaped by changing technologies, business practices, and notions of individuality. In the early 1930s, even as Cohan's career waned and Hollywood eclipsed theater in American popular culture, a theatrical editor for the Associated Press commented that Cohan was one of only 3 theatrical figures whose names automatically made the news section rather than the theater column. And in case you're wondering, the other 2 were David Belasco and George Bernard Shaw. When Cohan died on November 5th, 1942, the New York Times obituary was 6 columns and included 6 photographs, taking up the majority of a page, even during wartime reporting. Cohan had this Horatio Alger-like life story. His grandparents were among the millions who came to the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries from Ireland, spurred by poverty and famine. Cohan's father, Jerry, became a traveling performer, and his wife, Nellie, and then later their children, George and his older sister, Josie, joined him on the stage. So George grew up performing in vaudeville with his family's troupe. And this photo is of the family, who became known as the 4 Cohans. One of the places they performed was the Union Square Theater, 58 East 14th Street. Cohan talks about this and other experiences in the neighborhood in his autobiography. In it, a young, ambitious, and cocky George says to himself, "Union Square is mine, now for Broadway." He desperately wanted to make it in the so-called legitimate theater, and the remarkable part is that he did, big time. He wrote or co-wrote over 40 shows, including musical comedies, revues, and plays, and he published hundreds of songs. He performed from his childhood into his 60s and was seen at countless theaters across the country. One critic wrote early in Cohan's career, "There may be others who can act as well as he, some who can write plays equal to his, some who can stage them, some who can write songs, compose the music, and sing it when it was composed, and some who can dance as he does. But it would be hard to find any man of equal youth who can do all these things and do them as well as George Cohan does." Oscar Hammerstein II of Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote later about Cohan, "Never was a plant more indigenous to a particular part of the earth than was George M. Cohan to the United States of his day." Cohan was coming of age as the U.S. was coming into its own as a world power. He was born in 1878 and died in 1942, and I'm struck by the tremendous amount of change during these decades. The U.S. went from being predominantly agrarian to being a nation of cities. It went from relying on foreign investment to hosting the financial capital of the world. And it went from being seen in Europe as this cultural backwater to being a cultural force in its own right. When Cohan bounded onto the New York theater scene in the early 20th century, Broadway, the theatrical center of New York and the nation, was coming into its own. And there was no such thing as the musical then. There was vaudeville and operetta and melodrama and comic opera and farce, all of these different theatrical forms. Cohan was a key figure in bringing elements from each of these various forms together to form musical comedy, which later became musical theater, and in making it distinctly American. Cohan and his shows seemed to capture the zeitgeist of early 20th century America. The image here is from a musical called The Little Millionaire of 1911. A Los Angeles Times reporter wrote that with his multiple roles and enormous output, Mr. Cohan, believe me, is a sign of the times, the embodiment of the aggressive, unresting, clean, though perhaps slightly superficial spirit of American life at this rushing dawn of the 20th century. Cohan worked closely with many collaborators, especially co-producer Sam Harris, who managed the financial side, allowing Cohan to concentrate on the artistic side of things. By the 1910s, he was a Broadway mogul and became known as the man who owns Broadway, which was the title of one of his musicals. When the US entered World War I in 1917, he provided sonic fuel in the form of the wartime anthem, Over There.
Over there, send the word over there.
Cohan's opposition to Actors' Equity Association and the Actors' Strike of 1919 was a major turning point in his career. It marked the end of his successful business partnership with Sam Harris, and it diminished his reputation. Still, he continued to write, perform, and produce throughout the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. And here we see him as President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the 1937 musical I'd Rather Be Right, at nearly 60 years old. Cohan's career spanned decades that seem like centuries, to borrow an evocative phrase from scholar Sonny Stalter Pace about his close contemporary Gertrude Hoffman. Writing my book, one of the biggest challenges was how to capture and convey all that he did, all of the different hats he wore, and not just the professional hats like playwright and songwriter and so on, but also the roles he played in American cultural life. He was an emblem of patriotism, a proud Irish American, a Broadway magnate. So I decided to organize my book around these roles and then to look at his legacy in the 1942 film Yankee Doodle Dandy and beyond. And the book has this title because, as Cohan's longtime stage director Sam Forrest commented in 1942 when the film came out, Yankee Doodle Dandy is only one of a number of titles the motion picture people could have used for the story of Cohan. George, who inspired the nation with his patriotic songs, is the personification, too, of the best of Broadway, the best of Irish Americana. He reflected, maybe all that adds up to Yankee Doodle Dandy because it's all part of the Yankee or American heritage. Cohan was an unlikely figure to have made it big on Broadway, much less to have become known as a Yankee Doodle personification of patriotism. He was a third-generation Irish American at a time when the Irish occupied society's bottom rungs and were considered racially distinct from and inferior to Anglo-Saxon whites. Immigration and how the immigrants coming into the United States should fit into the nation were big topics of debate in this period, much as they are today. And here we see the main hall of Ellis Island's immigration station in a photo from somewhere between 1907 and 1912. As Cohan broke onto Broadway, the magazine Life, which was known to be anti-immigrant, railed against Irish influence, as we can see in this cartoon, the 17th of March, the day we celebrate. As literary scholar Martha Banta has discussed, this cartoon depicts what's meant to be a fearsome image, a motley assortment of non-Anglo-Saxon races, especially the Irish, subsumed into a national citizenry that celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday. Indeed, it has become a national holiday and one of my favorites. You can see the offensive imagery here. This kind of blatant bigotry was unfortunately all too common in the late 19th and early 20th century, and offensive cartoons like this one abound. Even some people who welcomed immigrants and believed they'd improve the United States, like Theodore Roosevelt, felt immigrants should fully assimilate and be undivided in their attachments. "We must Americanize newcomers in every way," he proclaimed in an 1894 essay. "The immigrant must revere only our flag. Not only must it come first, but no other flag should even come second. He must learn to celebrate Washington's birthday rather than that of the Queen or Kaiser, and the 4th of July instead of St. Patrick's Day. Above all, the immigrant must learn to talk and think and be United States." Early in his career, Cohan seemed to embody this vision of immigrant assimilation, veering away from his Irishness. His father, Jerry, had acted in Irish-themed entertainment like Hibernicons, which offered a pictorial tour of Ireland with songs and dances, combining the entertainment of variety and the moving panorama. But George billed himself as the Yankee Doodle comedian, or Yankee Doodle Cohan. The spotlight you can see here, this was a house organ, a newsletter that Cohan and his business colleagues sent out. And I also love this billboard headline about Cohan from 1906. "Yankee Doodle comedian is a nephew of Uncle Sam." Cohan was very good at self-promotion and publicizing himself. On stage, Cohan played hyper-patriotic American figures like Little Johnny Jones from the 1904 hit musical of the same name. As Jones, he proudly proclaimed himself a true blue American. Let's listen. This recording is by the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra, with Colin Pritchard singing a very good imitation of Cohan.
I'm the kid that saw the candy. I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy. I'm glad I am. I'm a real-life Yankee Doodle. Made my name and fame and boodle just like Mr. Doodle did by riding on a pony. I love to listen to the Dixie strain. I long to see the girl I left behind. And that ain't a Josh. She's a Yankee, by gosh. Anything about a Yankee that's a phony. I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy, a Yankee Doodle do or die. A real live nephew of my Uncle Sam's, born on the 4th of July. I've got a Yankee Doodle sweetheart. She's my Yankee Doodle joy. Yankee Doodle came to London just to ride the ponies. I am that Yankee Doodle boy.
The character Johnny Jones sings in this that he was born on the 4th of July, and Cohan also claimed July 4th as his birthday. It wasn't, as it turns out. Documentation shows otherwise. He was born on the 3rd, but why let a few hours get in the way of a good story? After the show, as one critic wrote, Cohan met this very evident desire for debauches of patriotic enthusiasm by designing flag songs and flag ballets and flag choruses and indeed whole flag plays. George Washington Jr., The American Idea, and The Yankee Prince, in all of which, no matter what else happened, George or somebody else was there waving the flag. And we can see him doing just that here in this photo from George Washington Jr. Cohan's flag waving brought mixed reviews from critics. Some found it distasteful and questioned the sincerity of his patriotism. One particularly harsh critic called him the inculcator of the chewing gum standard of taste. He was considered lowbrow. You can get a sense of his youthful insouciance in this photo. But while some critics didn't like him, his tactics won ringing endorsement from the box office. And they became known beyond the nation's borders as well. One of my favorite finds from my research was this sheet music for the Yankee Doodle Boy in Dutch. Even as he was proclaiming this patriotic identity and minimizing his own Irishness, Cohan began promoting the idea that immigrants like the Irish could be both proudly Irish and proudly American, could celebrate the 4th of July and St. Patrick's Day. In other words, that being a good American didn't mean giving up one's heritage. In his shows, he wrote secondary Irish characters who did not give up their Irishness when they came to the US, like Tim Harrigan in the 1907 show 50 Miles from Broadway, who sang one of Cohan's most beloved songs. And again, we'll hear the Paragon Ragtime Orchestra and Colin Pritchard.
Who is the man who will spend or will even lend? Harrigan, that's me. Who is your friend when you find that you need a friend? Harrigan, that's me. For I'm just as proud of my name, you see, as an emperor's or a king could be. Who is the man helps a man every time he can? Harrigan, that's me. H-A-R-R-I-G-A-N spells Harrigan. I'm proud of all the Irish blood that's in me. Divil a man can say a word against me. H-A-R-R-I-G-A-N-U-C is a name that a shame never has been connected with. Harrigan, that's me.
In the 1910s and 1920s, after Cohan had become an established fixture of Broadway, he turned more fully toward his Irish identity. He wrote 4 musicals about Irish American heroes or heroines, or a play with music in the case of The Voice of McConnell, and 3 musicals. Irish Americans during this period were economically and culturally on the rise, but they were still not fully accepted by the old stock. And World War I, along with the rebellion against British rule in Ireland, had stoked fears of divided loyalties among these so-called hyphenated Americans. In the 20s, President Coolidge declared that America must be kept American, and the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 severely restricted immigration. Meanwhile, a revived, reorganized Ku Klux Klan targeted Jewish and Catholic as well as Black Americans. Catholics fought the renewed prejudice, battling in what historian Lynn Dumenil describes as a war over the right to define what it meant to be American. Cohan's Irish American themed shows told stories of Irish American characters and families navigating encounters, usually romance, with the Anglo-American elite. Through these shows, Cohan depicted the Irish as both proudly Irish and good American citizens. While his shows were entertainment first and foremost, their sociopolitical messages were also clearly discernible. A passing comment in a 1924 Time article about the rise of Rosie O'Reilly tells us quite a bit in just a couple of sentences. George M. Cohan is responsible for this obvious defy to the Ku Klux Klan. He has been responsible for several others from the same mold in the past few seasons. Let's listen to a tune from one of those shows, Nellie Kelly, I Love You, from the 1922 show Little Nellie Kelly. Nellie is a Cinderella-like character, and this was a very popular type on Broadway at the time. In fact, shows about charming heroines who went from rags to riches were so common that one scholar calls the early 1920s on Broadway the Cinderella era. Cohan's Cinderellas were all Irish. In this song, Nellie is described as everyone's pal, everyone's gal, and wholesome and plain, right as the rain, using American colloquialisms, but in the waltz style that was common for Irish novelty songs of the era. Here's a contemporaneous recording of Nellie Kelly, I Love You.
Up in the Bronx, there lives the Nell of all Nellies. Everyone's pal, everyone's gal, everyone swears she's a saint unawares. Every Saturday night, night of delight, everyone gathers at Kelly's. Nobody ever knows out of all of her beaux if there's any particular boy. It's the same old song they sing. I love you. Oh, I love you. The boys are all mad about Nellie. the daughter of Officer Kelly. So the whole day long they bring flowers all dripping with dew, and they join in the chorus of Nellie Kelly, I love you.
This show was a favorite, and it later became the starting point for a new film, very different story, but with the same name, with Judy Garland. So we've seen, at least in a nutshell, how Cohan contributed to ideas of patriotism and Irish American identity, topics that I delve further into in the book. Another one of his most lasting legacies is that he made Broadway, Broadway. A producer and theater owner, as well as a playwright, songwriter, and performer, he approached Broadway as commercial as well as an artistic institution. But he also sold Broadway as an idea, and he could be quite sentimental about it. He wrote shows about Broadway and songs about it. In fact, Broadway appears in 4 of his show titles and over a dozen of his song titles. And he wrote about Broadway in the media, so much that he dubbed himself Broadway's press agent. At one point, when he was planning to retire from the stage, he even wrote a highly publicized letter to Broadway, "Dear old friend Broadway." He didn't retire, by the way. He kept saying that he was going to, and then he always came back. Cohan's songs, writings, and shows helped make Broadway this mystical symbol of American theatrical entertainment, and packaged that mythologized Broadway for consumption across the nation. The best known of Cohan's Broadway songs comes from that 1904 show that we heard a bit about earlier. It's "Give My Regards to Broadway" from Little Johnny Jones. The song comes from a scene set in London. Cohan frequently set his patriotic shows abroad, in part because it's sometimes easiest to see what's American when you're comparing it to other lands and peoples, and then in part because he really liked to make fun of the European nobility. In this song, Johnny Jones, the hero, is bidding goodbye to another American who's heading home, and he's a bit sad about it. He's not able to go home to the United States yet because he's a jockey who's been accused of throwing the English Derby, and he has to stay until his name is cleared. The lyrics reference specific places in New York: Coney Isle and the Waldorf Hotel, Herald Square, 42nd Street. However, with all the characters in England singing about going home and the yearning quality of the music, we get the sense that Broadway doesn't just mean New York here. It's also a stand-in for the United States. In this number in the original production, a rocket from the ship was the signal to Jones that his innocence had been proved. This was a spectacular bit of stage technology at the time. I want to show a bit of the recreation of this iconic sequence from the film Yankee Doodle Dandy in 1942, almost 4 decades after the show premiered, with the incomparable Jimmy Cagney playing Cohan. Musically, this Hollywood treatment is quite different from the original 1904 stage musical and not particularly authentic, but it's wonderful in its own right. Today, Cohan's songs and ideas live on largely without his name attached. Many in the United States grew up singing You're a Grand Old Flag and have heard Give My Regards to Broadway, but don't know who wrote them or anything about their creator for that matter. Cohan's statue stands in Times Square, yet is so dwarfed by the flashing billboards around him, iconic evidence of the commercialism that he embraced as part of Broadway entertainment, that his likeness is easily overlooked. His legacies, however, persist. The catchy, endearing patriotic songs, the mythologization of Broadway, the Americanization of the musical. Written at a fraught time in U.S. history by an Irish American, Cohan's songs and shows, and indeed the Yankee Doodle Dandy himself, remind us how national identity has long been contested and national culture has been created through that contestation. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a lot of fun. It was a great presentation to hear the music and see that video clip. And so, yeah, folks, if you have questions, start popping those. You already have started, but add extra into the Q&A or the chat. And I also put in the link to the book where you can purchase the book and a very kind discount code that Professor Kraft was able to get for us for a 30% off. The link and the code will also be included in the follow-up email. All right, to the questions. All right, do we have one? We have one here. Do you believe that because patriotism and nationalism are not as popular today, it affects the manner in which Cohan is viewed today?
Absolutely. There's a lot to his legacy, so much about how he contributed to Broadway, but what people know is the patriotic songs, and patriotism is more one-sided today. It's been co-opted by one side of the political spectrum, in a lot of cases by extremists. And so things, we are a grand old flag is bound up in all of that. And that's something I touch on briefly in the epilogue to my book. Even when George M. was premiered during the Vietnam era, it was something people were already struggling with. Like how do we view patriotism when it's not the sunny, optimistic era of the early 20th century? And thus, how do we view Cohan? So I do think that has affected how he's been viewed since his lifetime, and is one of the reasons that there hasn't been as much scholarly and authorial attention paid to him. It's a great question.
And we also had a couple questions. They want to know a little bit more about Cohan's personal life. Did he ever marry, have kids?
He did. He married and divorced and remarried, and he has kids and had grandkids, and many descendants.
And did he ever visit or perform in Ireland?
His shows appeared in England. He didn't perform himself in Ireland. He did get to visit. And interestingly, his shows were very popular in Australia. His sister Josie and her husband spent some time in Australia promoting his work there. But not as much in Ireland as one might think, given the Irish themed shows.
We have, what was the fallout from his anti-actors equity stance?
It's a great question. I would say that's the number two thing that really has impacted his legacy. And it's kind of curious because in the actors' strike of 1919, he would have been expected to, in many ways, understand the actors better than anybody. He had come up through the ranks. He was still an actor himself. But increasingly in the 1910s, his production work had become really important, and he was doing more of that than the acting work. And he took a stand against equity. He actually kept his own show running during the strike by stepping in and playing one of the roles, which did not make him very popular with the striking actors. Even when his business partner Sam Harris said, equity has won, George continued to hold firm against them. He tried to start a rival union, and that bitterness stayed for a long time. And I think it was personally, my book, I look more at his professional life than his personal life, but they merged there because his friendships with the people that he worked with on Broadway and in New York were very important to him. You had clubs like the Players, like the Lambs Club, all of these fraternal theatrical associations, and people were spending their time together and had these deep friendships. And so it was hard. It felt very personal during the strike, when people were on one side or the other. Even decades after his death, when Oscar Hammerstein II was raising money for that statue in Times Square, he wrote to Equity and asked for a contribution, and Equity sent the amount of a lifetime membership. And Hammerstein said, "We're not going to accept this, you poking George in his grave." But clearly there were strong feelings about it. That was in the 1950s, and even beyond that as well. So that was an interesting strand in my research, and it has impacted his legacy.
And to kind of to go back to the immigrant component, New York was famed for having, of course, so many different immigrant communities and that rich theater tradition, especially with Yiddish theater. Was there any overlap? Did he have any overlap or relationships with folks in these other immigrant theater communities?
That's a great question. He worked with so many Jewish Americans in the theater realm, and because of the spelling of his last name, it was frequently mistaken for Jewish. And in fact, one of the critics who really disliked him said some anti-Semitic things. One reason, I don't think he was involved with the Yiddish theater community that I know of. One reason so many Irish got into theater was the language barrier wasn't there, and they were able to get into theater, English language theater, fairly easily in the 19th century. But he did portray other immigrant groups in his musicals, sometimes not very favorably, particularly his Italian American characters. There are reasons that we don't see his shows staged as they were today, that they're not revived frequently. And some of those are just that they seem dated, but some of those are some offensive racial and ethnic characters and stereotypes that he was hardly unique in that. That was just part and parcel of theater of that era. But he worked very, very closely with a lot of Jewish Americans in theater.
We have one. It was said about Frank Capra that perhaps there was never America, it was all Frank Capra. Can the same be said about Cohan?
It's never America. I think it could be, yeah. For that era, that was very much what people thought of when they thought of the United States, where those were the tunes. It was funny, he did a lot of radio shows in the 1930s and said that he kind of pulled out all of his hits. He did his Irish stuff, some of his other things, but he said they always asked for the patriotic songs. That was the thing that he was most known for, that people loved him for. And I think his shows capture America in all of the best and the worst things about it, and all of its contradictions.
And you mentioned that he can almost be considered the most memorable, forgotten person. What got you interested? What drew you to him? And yeah, and tell us a little bit more about your research path and the different archives and things you visited.
I was working on a project on how immigrants tell their stories in musical theater, and I learned and knew that he had written some Irish American shows, as well as these patriotic tunes that I knew, and I had grown up singing them at the 4th of July. I had a We Sing America cassette tape that I loved, and was really interested to learn about his position as an Irish American, and then how much, for musical theater scholars, he's this very important figure, but how little was written about him since the biography in the 1970s, which is a very good one, by John McCabe. Um, and so I did manage to go to the Museum of the City of New York, and looking at those papers, looking at the scripts, looking at the scores. These aren't things that are published. You can't check most of them out from a library. But seeing those original things, and I found that it was really cool to look at them as documents and a time capsule to the past. And they're also quite funny. I didn't get to share some of the scenes from his shows today, but he had a great sense of humor. Some of I would just be chuckling to myself reading them. For the musical theater fans in the room, things like Urinetown, where they kind of comment on being in a musical, say, "Oh, the playwright, what is the playwright doing? These silly things." That's very Cohanian. He would do things like that, where the players are commenting on being in a show and poking fun at the playwright and themselves and breaking the fourth wall. Um, and so I got hooked. I was telling William earlier, I've also done a lot of work on more recent musical theater, had before this project, and found Cohan and his shows and the time period just fascinating.
Since the anniversary of his passing was just last week, someone wants to know how did he pass away?
Yeah, he had cancer. He passed away before his time. He was able to see Yankee Doodle Dandy before he died, the biopic about his life. It's kind of unusual that someone is alive when a biopic is being made about them, and he was involved in that process. And he was able to see that film, but he died too young.
And since you mentioned the film, someone asked, was anyone other than James Cagney considered for the role of playing Cohan in the film?
Cagney's brother really wanted them to look at Cagney, in part because of McCarthyism, and said something like, we should make a film with James playing the damnedest, most patriotic man in the country, George M. Cohan. And Cagney had that wonderful background, being able to do the dancing and the singing that a lot of people don't know about. So there may have been other people considered, but I think Cagney locked it down pretty quickly.
And other than Union Square on 14th Street, do you know of Cohan performing at any other theaters in the village?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. He did a lot in Brooklyn, a lot of his touring work, and then growing up, and then some of his shows performed in Brooklyn once he was a playwright and composer as well. I'm not sure about others in the village, and then some of the theaters that were there in his day aren't even there anymore, in New York. But making it to New York was a big thing for him as a child. His family's troupe toured around the country, and the goal was New York, but that it wasn't until later in his adolescence that they really got to make it big there. He was all over the place. He was in Pennsylvania and Ohio and New England, and I'm out in Utah, Salt Lake City even. They were there as what he was there as well. Um, saw the world, saw the United States.
Gosh, no, it's incredible that those folks traveled as much as they did. Oh, and someone wrote, it looks like Fred Astaire turned
Fred
down
Astaire
the
turned it down
role
wisely.
wisely, the person has. Okay. Um, Now you got to know Cohan through your research. If you were had like the magical chance of actually having met him, would be some of the things that you would want to ask him and know about him more on a personal level?
How how do you write as much as you do? As a writer, myself, I wonder how he found the time in the day to pump it all out. I mean, there are anecdotes of him um, writing the third act while they were rehearsing the first part of shows, but just how he managed to do as much as he did would be one thing. And then I would ask him, I would be very curious to get his candid opinion on um, the state of the nation, what his vision, what his idea of America was. Um, what we have, a lot of what we have of him is in newspapers and in magazines, and I would love to see, his unfiltered opinion of the current affairs of the day. Uh,
And was someone asked, have you had any reaction from to your book from any of Cohan's descendants?
I've had the great pleasure of meeting a few at events in California at the La Mirada Theater, and they've been wonderful and lovely and very helpful. Um, and I don't know their reaction to the book yet, but they've been very supportive in the research process, those who I have met.
So if there are no more questions, this will be our final question then. What would you consider Cohen's greatest legacy to playwrights, actors today, and what can they learn from him, both in the positive and the negative?
I think his view of Broadway, of his work, was very much a craftsman approach. He worked tremendously hard to know his trade. He grew up in it. And so his dedication to his trade, and this was a time of debate over what Broadway should be, and should it be more high art? Should it be more entertainment? The way that he brought different elements from different theatrical and musical forms together into something that worked so well that it's one of our main American art forms, and that he walked the line of emphasizing entertainment first and foremost, but always with this very professional, craftsman-like approach. I think that's one of his greatest legacies, and we see that still today on Broadway, that influence.
Well, this is a nice way to wrap up. We seem to have Cohen's great-granddaughter in our audience, and she said she loved your book. So, and I concur that it's a great book. This was a wonderful presentation, Elizabeth. Thank you so much. Everybody who joined, a very big thank you to you. We'll be sending out the link and the discount code to get Elizabeth's book in that follow-up email. I already saw a couple of people in the comments did mention that they had purchased the book. So very exciting. Elizabeth, another big thank you to you. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.